So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this OxDEG session. Before we get going, we just have a little housekeeping as usual. We're fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request that the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. If you could keep your cameras and microphones off unless directed to turn them on to ask a question, that would be great. Please use the chat function if you wish to ask a question, and we'll call on you when we're ready to go through the Q&A at the end. And please also use the chat section if you've got any technical issues, and we'll reply to you directly. And with that, I'll hand over to David.
Thank you very much. Before we start the today's talk, one little not an announcement as much. So we've started to think about finalizing the program for next term. So if people have suggestions, want to volunteer sessions, now is the time, please, to get in contact. We have at least one slot which we've kept open for so that we can respond to suggestions. And as we said last time, we will probably do a method surgery as well. So yeah, please get in touch with suggestions or volunteer or volunteer other people. Okay, so today's speaker is from LSE, and she's got a doctorate in anthropology from there. She's co-founder of the New Ethnographer, which is all about how to make fieldwork safer and more ethical, and is one of the co-founders of LSE's equivalent to OxDEG. And she's also a visiting lecturer at the media department in Al-Quds University, Jerusalem, as well as at the LSE. So with that, we'll hand over to Branwen and look forward to hearing her talk. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Can I just check you can all hear and see everything okay?
I can.
Great.
Thank you.
So early on in the process of conducting research on mobility and infrastructure among Palestinian refugees and Israeli settlers in the occupied Palestinian West Bank, as you might imagine, I hit a wall. This wall was not the illegal separation wall that divides the West Bank from Jerusalem and what is now the state of Israel beyond it, but a more abstract wall that combined the problem of physical and social access and my ability to conduct the task at hand. Due to a series of unforeseen circumstances, I was in the unusual position of living in Bethlehem, a Palestinian city in the West Bank, and commuting by car to Efrat, a nearby illegal Israeli settlement, in order to conduct my doctoral research. As an ethnic outsider to the close-knit and guarded religio-nationalist Israeli settler community, embroiled in an active conflict against their Palestinian neighbors, living elsewhere was inhibiting my ability to establish meaningful relationships with settlers. Israel's militarization of the region as part of its annexation of the West Bank also created regular physical obstacles to accessing the settlement, as did the frequency of Palestinian resistance to their presence. The wall between me and completing my research was, then, quite a tall one. Today, the work I present outlines how I applied unconventional methods to an already quite unconventional setting to get around this wall, namely the use of Tinder. For the uninitiated, Tinder is a geosocial networking app oriented towards matching users for meetups and dates. Following Grindr, an early foray into this field for the LGBTQ community founded in 2009, Tinder was launched in 2012 as the first dating app to directly target heterosexual users. The app functions through smartphone GPS technology by presenting users with a seemingly endless supply of other users with profiles made up of pictures with a space for short biographical text. Users can be viewed through Tinder's innovative swipe function. By swiping left or right, users can either like or discard profiles as they appear, according to the selection of criteria they choose, which include gender, age, and distance from user. Tinder's algorithm is bilateral in that only those users who have both swiped right on each other will be matched. Once a match is made, the two users can chat and arrange a meeting if desired. When framed in this way, Tinder can be seen as a powerful tool for ethnographers to employ in the pursuit of research. Combined with difficulties in accessing the settlement and building rapport with settlers, Tinder instead offered a seemingly endless supply of potential research participants in Efrat and its surrounding settlements with whom I could chat regularly. Duguay's adaptation of Albury and Byron's work on the phenomenon of off-label uses ideas, objects, and phenomena. Duguay's adaptation of Albury and Byron's work on the phenomenon of off-label uses of ideas, objects, and phenomena allows for a useful way of framing Tinder use for research purposes. Their use of the off-label concept derives from the uses of pharmaceutical drugs for which they are not advertised or prescribed. Duguay applied this concept to Tinder to analyze alternative or non-prescriptive uses of the app, which includes sex work, drug sales, spam bots, marketing, and political and social campaigns. Andrew Shields' work also draws upon this non-prescriptive or otherwise unexpected categorization of the uses of dating apps in the context of immigrants, for whom such apps provide a useful way to engage initially with others in the host country and to build social and logistical networks. As temporary migrants themselves, it seems reasonable that anthropologists may choose with technologies context. While there is a wide range of scholarly work conducted on the study of dating apps, very little has been conducted on the researcher's use of such apps. They tend to be approached as a field site in itself, rather than a method to accessing and communicating with members of one's field site. The research potential of these apps is manifold, particularly in cases of having to conduct research at distance, but also for those researchers struggling to locate research participants in their field. Following last year's outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the use of Tinder as a means to overcoming difficulties in accessing one's field site suddenly became more pertinent and more useful for researchers now facing the same challenge. In the first part of this presentation, I'll review the use of dating apps in social scientific literature before describing my own approach. I'll then outline the ways I use the data I collected before ending by looking at 3 different kinds of ethical concerns using Tinder in this off-label manner generates. So, social media and online forms of networking have become integrated into research practices for many researchers. Due to the proliferation of technology and mobile internet, we befriend our interlocutors on Facebook, follow them on Twitter or Instagram, and chat with them on WhatsApp, both while in the field and outside the platforms to seek out potential research participants before or while we are in the field, accepting friend requests from people we are put in touch with as particularly active or interesting in relation to our interests. In 2001, GPS signals became more accurate, generating renewed interest in the development of location-aware technologies. Within the broad range of academic literature on dating apps, focuses are often on Tinder and Grindr as the most popular options for heterosexual and LGBTQ users, respectively. These studies of the digitization of intimacies and practices surrounding dating and romance, however, have been dominated by approaches centering the motivations of user activity. Also under investigation have been the performative aspects of online profile making and interest around practices of user authenticity. Approaches have also focused on queer and sexual minority uses of dating apps and perceptions of safety and risk. Though fascinating, this body of work does not generally address the potential of dating apps for conducting research, but centers them as the object of inquiry itself. Some of these scholars have investigated the use of dating apps as an expansion of a new kind of virtual public sphere, proposing such apps as a new form of hybrid space and furthering Bain's notion that online interactions occur both in relationships that already exist offline and for the purpose of meeting new people for local offline relationships. Bain's work is an interesting way to think about the solutions to problems arising with practicing research both at distance and in potentially dangerous contexts. Another notable takeaway from the existing body of research is Bernhardt's and Abbott's understanding that today's internet layers physical and online spaces. Their work establishes dating apps as providing a public-private sphere for intimate relations to occur in. It also highlights that this unique sphere provides the user with ways of mapping the space around them through the app's users who populate it. The layering and mapping of space is a common ethnographic practice as a way of understanding and measuring the scope of one's field site. It therefore seemed logical to apply this practice to the use of social media, and particularly dating apps for locating potential research participants in this off-label way. Arguments for adopting the off-label use of dating apps for the purposes of research can gradually be found throughout the methodological approaches of all of these works. Anthropologists of the digital have long argued that in order to study technology, social media, and internet use, ethnographers must too be its users, participating while observing the online settings we research. Qualitative social scientific approaches to dating apps tend to rely instead on semi-structured interviews with app users in multiple locations in tandem with drawing on researchers' own experiences in using the app. Some have also analyzed profiles, necessitating the creation of their own profile in order to view those of others, but without using this profile to engage directly with other app users. Only a few scholars have gone one step further and used such profiles to contact other app users to request interviews. Among these are Atienza, Duguay, and Jorgensen, who all used researcher profiles explicitly stating that the purpose of the profile was to gain information and seek potential interviewees. Others, such as Kruger and Spilder, went as far as drawing on their own personal experiences using these dating apps in a non-professional setting. The reasons that the majority of these researchers may not be using their personal experiences in dating apps are manifold. Those not drawn to them through personal circumstance or preference lack the necessary experience to offer reflection on the phenomenon. Others, however, may have used them but prefer not to reveal their personal experiences due to a potential discomfort with the ethics of the process, or felt it detrimental to their professional reputations. As Atienza suggests, this exclusion of personal experience in dating apps is likely a result of informal and private recommendations from supervisors, colleagues, and publishers to censor references to romantic or intimate relations in scholarly work. And yet it would be naive to think that, to assume that ethnographers are not using dating apps at all, whether at home or in the field. Tinder has proven hugely popular worldwide. It has over 75 million active monthly users and is the most downloading dating application on Android devices worldwide. Academics are not immune. Tinder's popularity relies on its revolutionary potential to put users in contact remotely without the reliance of being in physical proximity, connections in pre-existing social networks, thus expanding one's dating pool exponentially. Without revealing a user's exact location, only the approximate distance between a user and their potential matches, it generates a unique public-private sphere in which any user might view another user's profile, but communication between the two can only be facilitated with mutual consent by each one having swiped right on the other. In its later iterations, Tinder overcame the limitations on locating nearby users by developing its paid passport upgrade, which allows users to place themselves in any global location and access other Tinder users. This popularity and the proliferation of swiping has seen Tinder enter the lexicon and imaginary of popular culture and media, with the result that Tinder's expected use has come to encompass the facilitation of dating and casual sex. Tindering has now become widely understood as a verb to mean to swipe through options of potential mates. Despite this, Tinder's on-label purpose is apparently not the facilitation of immediate and proximate encounters for sex. The platform insists, according to its website, that its intended use is the fastest and easiest way to meet new people. So, as an ethnographer who is willing to reflect on her use of Tinder, I'll now outline my approach. As mentioned in the introduction, my use of Tinder to conduct my doctoral fieldwork occurred as a resolution to the physical and social restrictions to accessing my field site. My work concerned the everyday mobilities of both Palestinian refugees and Israeli settlers in the occupied Palestinian West Bank, during which I worked first with Palestinian and later Israeli interlocutors to understand how their mobility was restricted locally through road and internet infrastructures. For those unfamiliar with the setting of the West Bank, I won't try and give a full history of this complex region, but I will offer a few contextual details. Following the mass immigration of Jews fleeing European persecution to Palestine in the early 20th century, the Israeli state was declared in 1948. As a result of these mass migrations, a significant proportion of the indigenous Palestinian population were forcibly expelled from the region to Gaza, the West Bank, which was at the time governed by neighboring Jordan, and further afield. These refugees have been denied their right of return by the Israeli state and live in exile, refusing resettlement, but also unable to leave the West Bank. In 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank, and it has remained under military control ever since. This occupation allowed Jewish Israelis, backed by their state, to build settlements in the West Bank to which entry is denied for Palestinians. These settlers now number over 600,000 and threaten Palestinian claims to the land, their livelihoods, and safety in the region. As my research is focused on understanding the everyday mobilities of its native Palestinian and newer Israeli settler populations, it was structured around the infrastructures they use to navigate, negotiate, and experience both mobility and immobility. Initially interested in physical mobility through transport and road networks, I quickly became aware of how telecommunications and social media also facilitated mobility for the region's inhabitants through their capacities as information sharing networks regarding safe movement in an often violent and discontinuous setting. Navigating the daily violence and conflict-like environment of the region, I too began to rely on social media to make friends and learn about the region. Despite this, I met most of my Palestinian research participants by virtue of my visibility as a foreigner. In my final year of fieldwork in 2018, I began working with Israeli settlers. Due to the cultural and religious restrictions of the settlement environment, I could not take residence there and instead commuted by car to the settlements from my home in Bethlehem. As well as not being physically present in the settlement, settlers' wariness of outsiders also made it difficult to meet people. Outsiders to the settlement community are usually Palestinian laborers, journalists, or other researchers, all framed as potentially dangerous for different reasons. While given far more access than Palestinians, journalists and researchers are often seen as presenting settlement and settlers in a negative light, and are therefore treated with hostility. When I began working in Efrat, my experience was very much the inverse of what I had encountered among Palestinians. As a white European woman, I did not bear much physiological difference to my new research interlocutors, and therefore my presence was not remarkable, especially in the large city setting of Efrat. Israeli settlers did not share their Arab neighbors' culture of hospitality, and with limited secular spaces for socializing, I took to social media again, joining local settlement Facebook groups and scouring them for events or potential ways to befriend people. Through this method, I found more inroads to the settler community, eventually finding a local who offered to tutor me in Hebrew, who then put me in touch with her friends and contacts, and gradually I was able to begin integrating myself into the life of the settlement. This integration, however, was limited by the unique demographics of settlements. As much of my research on mobility among Palestinians had been conducted with those in their late teens and 20s, I was interested to mirror this approach among settlers. The majority of people I met in the settlement, however, were mothers and parents, middle-aged or elderly. Settlements are slightly unusual spaces in that they are new. Efrat was only established in 1982. Settler children leave their settlements at the age of 17 or 18 to complete the 2 to 3 years of mandatory national service in the Israeli military. On returning from said service, many typically relocate to the urban centers of Israel, either for study or work. While many of the children of settlers prefer to eventually return to the West Bank settlements, properties are sold at high prices and to families only. Without commercial spaces for socializing or many leisure facilities, younger adults tend to reside elsewhere, returning to their familial homes in the settlements only at the weekend. Young people in settlements then are something of a part-time demographic, and without access to their homes, it became difficult to locate them in the physical space of the settlement. It was at this point that using Tinder occurred to me, as it is primarily marketed towards young people. I created a researcher profile with pictures of myself, a nickname, and a comment in the bio section stating that I was a researcher looking to meet new people in the region to learn about everyday life. I placed the limitations on the age of other users from 18 to 30, and while I selected my interest in both male and female users, I was mostly met with men. I set my distance settings to within 14 kilometers of the settlement, marking the approximate distance between Efrat and the checkpoint separating the West Bank from Israel, and was met with hundreds, if not thousands, of potential research participants. I struck up conversations with each match and invited those who I felt understood the nature of my intentions as a researcher to meet locally for interview. The methodological potential of Tinder, through its geolocation services and popularity then, relies as much on its capacity to serve as a directory of some of a region's permanent residents, but also by providing access to impermanent and mobile residents. Anyone who passed through the region, even if momentarily, could appear as a Tinder user in my vicinity. Chatting with settlers on Tinder also made me available to willing interview participants, as demonstrated in the picture shown, an excerpt from a conversation with a settler who, like many others, was interested in what he called the outside perspective on us. And we met for coffee several times. He enthusiastically shared with me his stories and experiences about growing up in the settlement, emphasizing his feelings of connection to the land and a greater sense of mobility compared to his earlier childhood years spent in the city. It was revelations such as this that formed an important contribution to my understanding of settler mobility in comparison to the restricted movement of my Palestinian friends. Before I go on, I'll address some of the most obvious limitations of using Tinder for research. First, the app will only put you in contact with those driven to use the app for its on-label purposes, who are most likely to be younger, single, although this is by no means guaranteed, and primarily heterosexual people looking to talk to members of the opposite sex for romantic purposes. This was certainly the case in my work, as I was met with primarily young men in the region, and the few women I matched with were less enthusiastic about responding to messages or requests to meet. In addition, the dynamic of mutual attraction governs who users will match with. Tinder is not a map of local users in the area, and consent to match must be given by both parties before chatting can take place. Furthermore, studies show that women are significantly more likely to make matches and receive more messages than men, which may potentially benefit female researchers over male. So now that I've addressed these early limitations, I'll move on to looking at the benefits of working with Tinder in my research setting. Tinder is conventionally associated with mobility, immediacy, proximity, and visibility. While visibility and proximity are helpful in conducting research, research at distance negates the importance of mobility and immediacy. In using Tinder to expand my network of research participants, I was often offered immediate meetings a short drive from my home and countless opportunities to chat on the online platform as people became interested in my work. As D'Souza, Silva, and Frith note, dating apps challenge traditional notions of public and private space. This hybrid space, as Das calls it, facilitates communication where it does not or cannot occur elsewhere. In the context of dating apps, this space allows people to foster a mobile intimacy, overlaying geographic space with an electronic position and relational presence. The conflation of this intimacy with relational presence can then be used to create cartographies of app users in relation to their physical environment and to enhance existing maps with unmapped phenomena. The map shown here demonstrates the kind of cartographic practice I was able to use Tinder to make, mapping data I already had about the region with information I gained using Tinder. This map requires some explanations with regards to the ethnographic context. The West Bank is in fact not easily understood through maps alone, particularly Google Maps, which neither recognizes Palestine as an independent state, nor maps Palestinian streets and spaces, including many of its towns and villages, with only some visible and many erased. Settlements, however, are fully mapped, and Efrat, where I conducted the majority of my research, is clearly visible, as are its surrounding settlement villages. Efrat is a large city settlement of around 10,000 Jewish Israeli residents that holds a reputation of being less religious and conservative than other nearby settlements, due to it intentionally and rather unusually not having a resident selection committee. These committees dictate who may live in each settlement depending on income, religious sect, linguistic community, and other socioeconomic factors, maintaining relative homogeneity within each settlement. Prior to using Tinder, I had a good sense of the very demographics of each neighboring settlement, but few contacts with whom I could ask further questions due to their relative conservatism compared to Efrat. To my surprise, I found Tinder users in Efrat and almost all of its neighboring settlements. Perhaps the most surprising was Beitar Elid, an ultra-Orthodox settlement a kilometer northeast of Efrat. The ultra-Orthodox traditionally eschew both modern technology and outsiders to their group, arranging marriages through family connections or professional matchmakers. The Tinder users I spoke to residing in Beitar Illit were the children of ultra-Orthodox Jewish parents who had decided to break with their community's traditions, but still returned to visit families or remained living in the settlement using technology and Tinder in secret. Since access to the ultra-Orthodox community is normally only possible for those who are themselves members, I was able to learn more about the group remotely without entering their physical space and breaching their cultural boundaries. The significance of using Tinder to create cartographies reveals itself in structures as well as groups that are not mapped, including Israeli military bases and checkpoints that are not visible either on Google or any other mapping software. The local IDF military base in the region is populated by hundreds of soldiers in regular rotation who are stationed in checkpoints and public spaces around the West Bank. Though I came to know the vague location of the base from driving around, there was no way of approaching it or speaking with its resident soldiers on duty around the region. The proliferation of its Tinder-using soldiers and their invitations to visit the base gave away its location, along with interesting descriptions of their experiences of everyday life in the region, with the unique viewpoint of enforcing mobility restrictions on Palestinians. Perhaps unsurprisingly, locally stationed soldiers made a significant proportion of the Tinder users I encountered, as many originated from more secular backgrounds further afield and were bored, making them enthusiastic chatters on Tinder. The region's ubiquitous military checkpoints are another unmapped feature of the West Bank. These checkpoints are established by the Israeli military to prevent the passage of Palestinian residents of the West Bank outside of its boundaries, or to limit their mobility within it. Residents familiar with the region know the locations of permanent checkpoints, manned by both Israeli soldiers and privately employed security agents. As a civilian passing through the checkpoint, ways of making conversation with the security agents and soldiers working there were limited. Through Tinder, however, it became possible to locate and map where the checkpoints they worked at were, as well as gaining an insight to the everyday goings-on of checkpoints from the perspective of their employees. And crucially for my research, how they understood and justified the limiting of Palestinian mobility. Through this work, I was also occasionally able to determine the location of flying or impermanent checkpoints, established spontaneously in Palestinian areas by soldiers on duty, revealing the boredom of the job they faced. While these are regular features of Palestinian life in the West Bank, the ability to engage with their enforcers in this informal and colloquial fashion marked a real change in the ways I was able to understand and communicate with the regime of mobility control that shapes the region. My audience may now be thinking, this all seems terribly unethical. The ethical ramifications of using data soldiers on active duty reveal through a dating app are, of course, questionable. However, and as Stein and Kunzman note, the Israeli army has embraced social media and actively uses it for promotional content. As a military made up of young people active on social media, this has not always gone smoothly. In fact, in the wake of several high-profile incidents of Israeli soldiers' activity on dating apps, resulting in data breaches, perhaps most notably Hamas's use of tricking soldiers into downloading spyware on their phones through the promise of fake dating apps, putting them in contact with local Jewish singles, warnings were issued to soldiers, instructing them not to talk to strangers on social media and avoid sharing classified information. The soldiers with whom I was in contact through Tinder, however, were appearing to act in breach of these recommendations or otherwise unaware of them. I often received information on soldiers' exact locations without asking, with many being keen to share with me the nature of their work or their boredom in being stationed in surveillance or checkpoint positions. Despite being invited by some to visit them in their places of work, including the military base and the checkpoints, I declined on the basis of potentially putting their positions at risk, and instead opted to communicate with them remotely. As you might have noticed through this presentation, all the Tinder users I worked with have been duly anonymized, particularly those serving on active duty, and any information that might have put them at risk has been excised. In addition, I was mindful to reinforce the issue of informed consent regularly with my users, though they showed little regard for it. As well as the ethical considerations outlined above, the use of Tinder to conduct anthropological research can generate some feelings of discomfort in relation to both the appropriacy and the sexual subjectivities of anthropologists at work. These discomforts are worth engaging with for the purpose of interrogating a paradox within anthropology around the generation of close relationships with our interlocutors. On one hand, we are advised to go to the field and build intimate kin-like relationships with our research participants as a strategy for achieving integration into and enhanced understanding of their cultures. On the other, there is a silence and even a taboo around the formation of these relationships outside of asexual and non-romantic boundaries. The only acceptable relations we should have with our research participants, it seems, are those devoid of any flirtatious, romantic, or sexual elements, and the anthropologist should not discuss their sexual subjectivity while in the field. The purpose of this paper is not to delve at length into this paradox, which has been discussed by others. Instead, it is to use the example of dating apps in research methodology to contribute to the point that these authors already make, that sexual and romantic encounters can be analytically useful for the researchers' understanding of both their own subjectivity and their theoretical arguments. Because of its romantic potential, the use of Tinder in this off-label manner draws emphasis to the discomfort around the potential of such encounters by using an app which facilitates an environment for dating and other forms of intimacy. This discomfort also speaks to the failure of many anthropologists to consider their sexual subjectivities. Following a disciplinary emphasis on reflexivity initiated in the 1980s, many of us are still lacking in our willingness to consider the impact our intersubjective identities have on our capacities to interpret and produce knowledge. Despite an historic disciplinary fascination with the sex lives of others, the sexual subjectivity of heterosexual anthropologists is largely silenced, likely due to two antiquated conceptions still pervasive in our practice. The first conception is that sexual intimacy in the field is professionally unethical, and the second draws on more troubling and Orientalist notions of maintaining racialized boundaries between the anthropologist and others. The maintenance of these racialized boundaries reveals the importance of a reflexive practice in anthropological research. Dependent both on the side of the research and on the gendered, racial, and financial power dynamics in the event of sexual activity can become exacerbated and potentially problematic. However, and as Blackwood notes, many male anthropologists, through their silence on the subject of sexuality in the field, have failed to make connections between their own privilege and power as situated rather than unmarked men, and the very personal experience of sexual involvement. Ong's 2017 study of dating app use by humanitarian workers in host countries details the ways that these encounters reinforce colonially informed power dynamics between visiting white humanitarians and locals. To borrow again from Blackwood, it is helpful to acknowledge that censorship on the issue of sexual subjectivity is limiting a reflexive anthropology to the extent that its advocates are unwilling to situate themselves as gendered or ethnic beings. My own experiences working with settlers through Tinder did not seem to me to replicate these dynamics, as I came from similar socioeconomic standing to the settlers with whom I worked. In fact, as a woman and an outsider, I was often interpreted as weaker, both in terms of strength and psyche, than the Israelis that I matched with on Tinder. This message was certainly interpolated to me through my engagement with soldiers, Israeli border officials, and everyday encounters with the military authorities part of my field site. So too, through communicating with younger men on Tinder, amongst whom I rather naively expected to be treated as equal, was this message continuously reinforced. In fact, this framing of myself as inferior to Israeli men proved a useful approach with which to conduct my research on Tinder. Anthropologist outsiders can often benefit from being seen as an innocent ingenue, someone who knows nothing about the cultures they study to conduct their research. Using Tinder, where gendered and racialized stereotypes are often drawn out and emphasized, the exploitation of such stereotyping proved fruitful for my work. Though I offered nothing more than an opportunity to talk about the everyday life of the region, I was in part relying on gendered notions of female naivete, potential interest in dating over participating in my research, and potential flirtatious dynamics that came as part and parcel of the platform I was using to conduct the research. While I only agreed to pursue conversations and physically meet those with whom I felt confident that they accepted the non-romantic aspect of the encounter, it would be naive to assume that some participants did not feel this decision could be reversed. My research interests, as many women researchers find, were often interpreted by my interlocutors as an excuse to strike up conversation, and not, perhaps disappointingly, driven by my interest in the intersections of infrastructure and mobility theory in the social sciences. The productive power of flirtation and the fostering of intimacy in this setting were therefore used not only because they were appropriate for the platform, but to generate and maintain connections and relationships. Sexuality as an aspect of the anthropologist's subjectivity in this context, then, offers a point in which it is both relevant and useful analytically when used in consideration of the ethics involved. My argument is that this comfort with the idea of an anthropologist having any kind of sexual subjectivity limits our theoretical and our methodological contributions to our discipline. In fact, and as Lyons argues, anthropology has more to gain than lose by including sexuality. My intention in this project was not to trick potential research participants into speaking with me or conceal my intentions. It is likely that many of those with whom we conduct research may misunderstand the purpose or intention of our desires to meet with them. The exercise of expectation management is useful in such scenarios, and given the nature of the platform in question, I was open with each person I spoke with. Through the text explaining the project on my profile and in conversation about my intentions in learning about life in the region, I reinforced this message as much as possible. While I suspect that many participants did not believe this or match my intention, at this point I had gained their consent to continue the conversation and to potentially meet, which many pushed forward. Tinder has accrued a particular reputation as sex-focused and shallow through its focus on user images and a swipe-based interface that ultimately leads to the gamification of seeking one's potential soulmate. I certainly came across users who demonstrated this approach. However, as Kruger and Spilder suggest, this in itself is worth investigating. Tinder has been highly influential in the ways that it has shaped modern dating, streamlining pre-existing online platforms that emphasized an equal balance of biographic text alongside pictures. From the perspective of a researcher attempting to make contacts in the field, however, this stream of images is viewed without the superficiality its users are decried as holding. In this sense, if Tinder is said to streamline the matchmaking process, albeit unethically, can it not also be viewed as streamlining the research process? In this case, the ethical concerns in question are to make apparent the user's off-label intentions for the app, clarified through text, regular reinforcements, and the management of one's matcher's expectations. Ethical research also relies upon a trusting relationship between those involved in the project and the researcher. However, anthropological ethics can be somewhat malleable. This malleability is not to allow ourselves to frame certain circumstances or relationships as ethical for our convenience, but to empower the ethnographer to have information and confidence in deciding what is ethical in a variety of situations they are not able to predict. In this sense, ethical decision-making is a skill that requires training, careful thought, and experience. With the use of Tinder in mind, however, it may also rely upon what might be termed a loosening of the academic collar on the wide range of emotions and experiences that touch on methods we use in our practice. An understanding of ethics as situated and non-specific, then, is helpful. In addition, it is useful to remember that, and as Simpson points out, existing research ethics codes are paternalistic and oriented towards geographies which have disappeared. In this work, I argue it is not just geographies which have disappeared, but also attitudes. Reliance on ethical guidance from a Malinowskian era no longer seems applicable to today's research. Finally, I draw attention to the implications of safety and research ethics that using Tinder as a method highlights. With the normalization of dating culture and later dating apps, came a discourse around safety, in part driven by a media scandalizing the sudden seeming availability of casual sex between strangers, seen as originating from dating apps. Popular media and in-app interfaces offered guidance and commentary on the ways in which users could stay safe when meeting people through the apps. Such discourse includes recommendations such as meeting in public, alerting a friend about the date, being in control of your transportation, and leaving if you feel uncomfortable or threatened. Tinder has even recently introduced a panic button that users can activate to alert emergency services if they feel unsafe while meeting another user. These features, however, ultimately account for the fact that meeting previously unknown people can be a particularly unsafe practice. While Tinder claims it has been developed with safety in mind, much of its safety features and advice have arrived retrospectively and in response to dangers app users have already faced. This advice leads us to an important conversation researchers are beginning to have about safety and preparation for the field. Despite empirical similarities between many fieldwork encounters and dates, i.e. the meeting of a stranger outside of one's social network, often in their homes or private places, Fieldwork skills are often taught without consideration for researcher safety and mental health. In ethnographic training courses, the free-form and vague aspects of participant observation are often emphasized at the expense of reminding researchers that their and their interlocutor's safety is paramount. This conversation with a settler demonstrates this paradox. While a trip around the region with a local seemed like an excellent opportunity as an ethnographer, as a woman operating in a dating context, the idea of meeting a stranger, using their transport to roam around the countryside seemed objectively unsafe. Ethnographic practice and anthropology as a discipline may benefit from adopting the safety practices used in dating into its training and its attitudes to researcher safety. Since the range of motivations for the use of Tinder is broad, with little evidence in terms of visible cues from others to confirm or refute expectations, the exercise of expectation management that occurs in pre-meeting chat on Tinder can also be of use to researchers using such platforms or in conducting research in general. As Timmermans and Courtois point out, gaining an understanding of another user's motives is critical in the outcome of the meeting, a logic that can be applied to research as well as dating. On more than one occasion during my fieldwork, I arrived at interviews that were swiftly cancelled, relocated, or delayed due to a misinterpretation of my intent as a researcher. Applying the safety practices associated with dating, however, I felt confident that I would be able to conduct interviews with contacts made through Tinder safely without putting myself at risk or being concerned about losing the trust or confidence of a potentially important interlocutor. Incorporating the use of Tinder into my research on mobility forced me to think about the different ways in which mobility can be achieved. Using distance methods to accrue and talk to research participants allowed me to respond creatively to social and physical limitations in my research. The use of dating apps in research also reveals important discussions on the practicalities and analytic purposes of the sexual subjectivity of researchers. In doing so, it invites anthropologists to reflect further on their subjectivity, moving this process beyond what can feel like a limited engagement with the subject and incorporating researcher safety into the process. During the current COVID-19 pandemic, many anthropologists have faced new and dangerous challenges to their research. Exposure to the COVID-19 virus, cancelled research trips, social distancing, loss of funding, additional stressors to mental health, including anxiety, depression, and grief, and increased caring responsibilities are among the numerous challenges we faced and continue to face as vaccines continue to be unequally distributed. The relevance of this study, then, may provide useful inspiration for researchers looking to continue their work safely. It is noteworthy that for the early period of the COVID-19 pandemic, Tinder and other dating apps included a message reminding users of WHO's safety advice and offering strategies to avoid the temptation to break the rules of variously imposed lockdowns and instead hold dates and meetings remotely. The normalization of this practice further lends itself to the function of dating apps as a tool to extend one's social network and talk to new people at distance. In fact, remotely meeting new people through dating apps became its on-label use, with Tinder making the passport feature free for the month of April in 2020. This move demonstrated that Tinder's on-label use could rapidly shift to accommodate changing global circumstances. Once aimed at facilitating immediate physical meetups, Tinder now actively encourages its users to expand their dating to those beyond the physically and socially proximate. The many limitations placed on human activity during the COVID-19 lockdowns generated creative responses from those seeking to date, many of which are worthy of reflection for researchers. Quite clearly then, Tinder is not likely to be the solution for many anthropologists seeking to conduct research at different or expand their pool of contacts. In fact, in many cases, it may be inappropriate, inadvisable, or inconclusive. What the arguments I've made in this paper show, however, is that anthropological research often requires creativity, and this creativity deserves to be accompanied by nuanced and thoughtful considerations of how it impacts both ourselves and our research participants. Often anthropological research emphasizes its location in some ethical or practical gray areas. The method is intangible and relies on simply being there and finding things out through talking to people. Without disregarding the important ethical considerations using dating apps in research present, when our research environments place prohibitions on our mobility, innovative and off-label solutions can arise. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So
Hello. Hi. So thank you very much. A very interesting paper and lots to think about. I think there will probably be lots of questions, which I will monitor here in the chat. And while we're waiting for those to come in, maybe I can start off by just asking you a brief question. First of all, I'm aware that your initial invitation to speak at OxDEG was some time ago now, and when this research was probably a little bit fresher, and I'm really glad that you were able to make it. I guess the first question I would ask is more, again, sort of returning to your theme of subjectivity, to ask you a little bit about your own subjectivity as a researcher in undertaking these methods. And specifically, I'm just wondering what sort of response, feedback you got from the university, from sort of safety guidelines for researchers, for the CUREC approval, or even from supervisors and fellow anthropologists about these methods when you first proposed them. If you could tell us a little bit about what your journey was like and how you navigated that.
Yes, certainly. I mean, that's a really, I'm glad to be asked that question, because it's actually a really big part of my doctoral thesis, that there was very little preparation both on my part and the university's part before conducting this fieldwork. I knew I was going to be in settlements and in Palestinian spaces in the West Bank, but I didn't have any much further information. Interestingly, well, perhaps not surprisingly, but interestingly, there was much more concern taken in risk assessments over me living in a Palestinian refugee camp and working with Palestinians than there were about me working with settlers, which proved to me the far more dangerous aspect of the fieldwork. And there was also at the time, in terms of risk assessments and concerns from my supervisors, no consideration for the impact of this kind of work on mental health, which we have since successfully campaigned to change, even if it's, you know, still essentially a box ticking exercise on have you considered your mental health before you do fieldwork. But I mean, some of this was a happy accident. It was a very, very difficult and long fieldwork over 3 years. But with colleagues I met in the field, we now run this organization called the New Ethnographer, where we offer training that offers, you know, the health and safety and the health and those kind of self-care aspects of fieldwork. So it's become a much bigger conversation, which is a really positive outcome.
Good. Okay, thank you. David, Rebecca, did you want to jump in with initial questions?
Okay, I've got a little question. Which is basically about Tinder's terms and conditions. I mean, research on Facebook has been hugely inhibited by their attempts to prohibit researchers from using the platform. What does Tinder actually say about this?
I can't find anything myself about researchers using Tinder, and I think that's something to do with their sort of intentional vagueness around what their on-label purpose is, because it shifts every few years. So actually, at the time I wrote this paper last year, the slogan of Tinder was just meet new people. Now the slogan is swipe right, which is much more oriented towards, you know, finding a match. But it's been quite adamant in relation to its bad reputation, or its sort of, you know, subversive reputation, that it's just for people to talk to people with.
So in that sense, they would likely welcome your use.
Yeah, they might. I mean, I like to think so, sure.
Okay, I think there was a question from Alex, which I think is very similar. How do you manage terms of service within your process? Do the terms of service prohibit research or screen shooting or anything like that? And how do you manage that relationship? I don't know if there's anything to add to what you've said to David, but.
I mean, perhaps I should add that anthropologists have, as I mentioned in this presentation, a bit of a looser relationship with strict research ethics than perhaps other disciplines do. So quite often I get these questions from people from a non-anthro background that it's not to denigrate anthropology. I think we just understand the ethics as occasionally contextual and more to do with causing other people harm. So as long as you're taking reasonable steps and gaining informed consent, the aim is to avoid harm to people involved in your research as much as possible, which for me just meant, a huge amount of work, blacking out all of people's faces and names and scouring all of the screenshots for any kind of identifying details, which was balanced with, at the same time, people being really, really keen to share a lot of potentially quite dangerous information with me. So managing people's expectations there as well.
Great, thank you. I've got a question here from Julian. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. Could you tell us a little bit more about your selection process when you were looking for potential interlocutors, and what were your ethical considerations regarding this process?
Well, thank you. It's such a joy to talk about this paper because it's very much a smaller part of a bigger project. So I haven't had the chance to go into it so in depth. So I really appreciate, people coming along. In terms of selection criteria, there were none. I'd never reached kind of the end of Tinder. I never ran out of people to potentially match with. Partly because people traveled up and down through the West Bank region, and the soldiers rotated very regularly. So it was really anyone, men or women between 18 and 30, because those were the demographics I didn't have access to. I tried not to swipe right on what looked like sort of bot accounts or advertising accounts and things like that. But if I did match with those people, found them very chatty. Quite often, if they were just there to do advertising, they were actually quite excited to talk to a human. So that was quite nice. But yeah, in terms of the ethics, I think I've covered that, unless there's a more specific question.
Thank you. I've got another question here from Theodora Sutton. I'm curious to know how two things have evolved over time: being able to to put your name to your research, for example, with being able to go back to your field site in the future, and with talking openly about the use of Tinder in research. Were you nervous to talk about it?
Oh, thanks, Theodora. It's nice to have you here. I have to thank Theodora, actually, who recommended me to come and do a talk at OxDEG, so I'm very grateful. Yeah, talking about this work has been a bit troubling, because naturally there's real concerns about working with both Palestinians and Israelis, and I certainly couldn't talk about any of this while I was in the field, and because I was there for 3 years. All of this is done in retrospect. I did publish with Allegro Lab a little introductory piece to this work under a pseudonym. But then got crossed because I wanted to kind of claim the glory, and it looks quite weird on your CV having things under a pseudonym. So these days, now that I've finished my PhD, I'm starting to think about what I can do, and that also my future research plans don't take me back to Palestine. Because of course, talking about working with Palestinians and potentially talking about working with settlers can lead to real difficulties re-entering Palestine and Israel, that the Israeli authorities don't like it. So I hope that answers that part of the question. In terms of going forward, this paper is a draft for New Media and Society. So this has been very helpful. But, I also think in terms of the ethics of working with Palestinians, there is a duty to make the research you've done, worthy and share it and make it public. And also, this is a very early contribution to settler studies, which is quite a small field of research in English. And especially in terms of studies that put settler lives alongside Palestinians. So in that sense, I'm kind of keen to publish for my career, as long as it can be safe for the people I worked with.
Thank you. Let's see, there's another question here. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I was wondering if you could do it all again, would you do some things differently?
No, that's a great question. My advice to anyone going to do fieldwork now is don't go somewhere where you don't speak the language, or you're having to learn 2 languages, because the fact that Tinder is not available in Hebrew meant that I was working primarily in English, and while I was learning Hebrew, and my Hebrew is okay, it was quite hard to manage. So it's really the linguistic bits that I would do differently. But I think that, you know, for me, this work on Tinder is nice because it emphasizes this idea that anthropological fieldwork and ethnography are not really things that you can plan. That, you know, it's good to be armed with a lot of tools and ideas and education about the region, but you know, all this entire Tinder project came out of a series of disasters. You know, I would drive to the settlement every day and absolutely no one would talk to me. I spent 3 months going to Zumba classes because that was the only secular space in the settlement that I could get into, and no one would talk to me. So eventually I got, you know, a group of mothers to talk to me, but I wanted to talk to young people. And so it really resolved this problem of sitting or driving up and down and, you know, seeing young people and having absolutely no way to talk to them, whether they were in cars driving past me or soldiers in checkpoints where it was, you know, totally impossible to have a chat. So you know, there's a lot of positive anthropological outcomes and even innovations come out of making mistakes or not being prepared.
Great. Okay, David, you might be muted there.
Yeah, I am muted, sorry. So do I infer that there's an Arabic version?
That's a good question. There isn't really. That Tinder largely operates for the secular, and because of Palestinian culture being quite conservative, it invokes logics of shame and honor. So women, certainly in the refugee camp context, which is much more socially and religiously conservative, even women putting pictures of themselves online is considered haram, and so Tinder really wouldn't fly. I often had a little look at, I mean, Palestinian profiles would pop up alongside the Israeli ones. There's no way of filtering that. But there were very, very few women, maybe one or two, who were quite bold. What you did get was a lot of Palestinians outside of Palestine using the passport feature, so sort of relocating them to Jerusalem or Bethlehem, and they were looking for, you know, husbands and wives in the homeland, which was really interesting, and that would be worth doing some further research on. But in terms of the ethics of doing that, I think it would be quite complex, and people might not be willing to talk so freely about it.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? I don't know if Rebecca has any questions. Anybody else in the chat? Well, while we're waiting for people to continue to collect their ideas, maybe I can just ask one other question, which I guess has to do with, and you did allude to it in your talk, and I think possibly also in the earlier, was it a sort of blog that you published?
Yeah.
And that has to do with, and you mentioned in the talk, and this was a question that I had when I read the blog originally, whether, you know, how soon you were able to insert the idea of being a researcher. You know, I guess, was that in your profile? So that, was that up front? And if it wasn't up front, were there people that were initially unclear, you know, whether, and how did you navigate that? So for example, if people thought, okay, you're a researcher, this is interesting, I'll see what it's about, or did you often start off on a romance, on the kind of romance pretense, and then have to navigate towards researcher? I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that, because most of us are, I mean, in the case of my doctoral research, you know, I had my research foot so far forward that it was less ambiguous. Yeah.
That's a great question. So I guess it was a very, very brief period of trial and error in which I learned a bit more about what I already knew about Israeli dating culture, which is that it mirrors Israeli culture, which is incredibly direct and quite brusque, and there's not a lot of what you know, some of the pleasantries that, especially, you know, living in Britain for so long, you learn that there's a lot of politeness and things you should say before you can ask a direct question. And Arabic culture, you know, uses these kind of tactics of politeness exponentially more than British. So it was a real shock to the system, because you would, I mean, I showed a slide of an Israeli on Tinder saying, you know, are you looking for sex? And so if I didn't lead with, hello, I'm a researcher, research, you know, you're not going to get what you might be looking for here. Then it was really assumed that I was kind of playing some sort of shy woman character who was, you know, not, maybe didn't want to be caught on Tinder by family members or something like that. So when possible, I didn't want to really, be a bore. I wanted to kind of, encourage people to talk to me and to have a friendly chat. But that was really balanced with, don't you forget I'm a researcher and I'm really not wanting to meet for a date or not wanting to disappoint you or lead you on or something like that, especially when it came to meeting people in person, because I was really mindful that I didn't want to, waste my time or theirs.
Yeah, thank you. Alex Blanford has a question. You mentioned meat in the introduction, but I was wondering about the presentation that people give on Tinder and whether you saw things that made you consider the way that people present and market themselves in a way to trick, ? You as a researcher as much as a potential date.
Could you elaborate a bit? That's an interesting question. I want to answer it properly.
Let's see. I'm just wondering if Alex wants to elaborate. Yeah, there he is.
So what I was thinking about here was like, yeah, you could say that you're, you could do the introduction and you set people's expectations, but I was just thinking about sort of coming of age in Samoa and kind of going, how much could your informants go, yeah, all right, because it's this distant thing, and because my field site's on Slack, and I find it quite similar that people have a sort of, they're playing a particular character there, and not that that's not, and I'm not sort of searching for some root authenticity to this, but I'm wondering about what you thought about sort of performance and whether that was whether you got the impression that people were performing in the same way they would have been if they were asking you for a date, like if they were just in that mode on Tinder, or if they slipped into, oh fine, this isn't a date thing, we'll just chat.
That's a good question. So I put a lot of thought into my Tinder profile, because I also created dual social media profiles for working with Israelis as opposed to Palestinians, because it would have really complicated my relationship with the settlers if they saw lots of Arabic on my Facebook account and things. So I actually got a friend to drive around the West Bank with me and take some pictures in front of kind of settlements as opposed to in front of like Palestinian tourist attractions or things like that I found I really didn't have a lot of neutral pictures. And the other thing I was trying to do was present myself as politically neutral, partly because you spend a lot of time doing that in order to gain access to Palestine, that any kind of display of allegiance with Palestinians will arouse Israeli suspicion straight away and can lead to deportation at best and arrest at worst, as well as complicating lives for your Palestinian friends. So there's a lot of kind of political thought that goes into how to present yourself. On top of that, I suppose I was pleasantly surprised by the outcome of this, what started as a little experiment, but that people were really keen to chat, even if, I actually ended up, dare I say, quite bored, because I had really too many people who were chatting with me at constant times of day and coming through to my phone all the time. And when I was hanging out with Palestinian friends, they were looking at my phone like, why do you have, 600 messages on Tinder? And actually Theodora did some really nice work about maintaining boundaries on social media and your phone and your laptop that I really wish I'd read and thought about before I started this Tinder project. But no, I was lucky that there's also all this research that I mentioned to suggest that unfortunately it's much easier for women on social media apps, that as long as you're sort of, I don't know, smiling nicely and a woman, there's always going to be men who will want to chat to you, and especially as an under-researched demographic, settlers really seemed quite keen. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Theodora has another question. Did you have to list yourself as male to find more female interlocutors, or were they all women seeking women?
I didn't actually know about that aspect of Tinder. Having not used it a huge amount myself personally, it never occurred to me that that I could change my gender to man. But then I thought that when I found out about that later, it occurred to me that then I'm sort of leaning more heavily into catfishing than I felt comfortable doing in my work as well. So I thought it kind of better to, in a practice that already felt like it was complicating authenticity, to kind of stay within the realms of not surprising people too much, I suppose.
I wonder if you could say something about, in terms of the final demographics of people who informed your research, male, female, Israeli Palestinian? I mean, I'm just kind of curious. In the end, how did that work out?
In the whole doctoral project, you mean?
Yeah, or even maybe just the Tinder part.
The Tinder part, I mean, the Tinder was really only with Israelis. That I didn't talk to any Palestinians on there. The cultures of sort of shame and honor also caused me to be very cautious with using it among Palestinians, that I was already in quite an unusual position as an unmarried woman without her family there, that I was trying to avoid any kind of further scandalous reputation. Among Israelis, I mean, it was almost all men between 18 and 35. Actually, a lot, and interestingly, because of the way that the algorithms work, when I met young people in real life in ways unconnected to Tinder, they would then quite commonly pop up on my Tinder, which then started to cause problems because, you know, either I'd met them through their girlfriend, or their parents would not be very happy they were on it if they were conservative, or they would then want to chat to me on Tinder, and it became very complex. But the demographics, at least of the Tinder study, were almost all men. And in more, I mean, it's then becomes quite an unbalanced set of ethnographic data, because I have young men 18 to 20, and then almost entirely women aged, you know, 40 and above. So it's a bit of a mishmash.
Good. Thank you. Any other questions? We have a little bit of time left. If there are other questions for Branwen. Here is, let's see, how representative of the settler population would you consider your sample, given that most settlers are of a religiousness that wouldn't be using Tinder?
That's a good question. So the specific settlement in which I was working, called Efrat, is quite unusual, because most of them are very small, or at least smaller village settlements. And as I said in the presentation, they're governed by these selection committees. So they're kind of grouped by each settlement according to how conservative they are, you know, down to quite specific things like, is it okay to use electricity on Shabbat or drive a car, or so on. So Efrat is really unusual, and therefore attracts a more liberal kind of settler, and it also attracts a very, very upper middle class demographic. It's known locally as the Upper West Bank, you know, as a parody of being the Upper West Side of New York. And it's also got a very, very large Anglophone population who are recent migrants from North America, the UK, and South Africa. So it's a bit different overall. And I chose to work there specifically because I would have found it easier to integrate. That because I'm not Jewish myself, like it would have been much harder in other settlements where people are more cautious about involving outsiders, especially inside the home, and breaches of Judaic law and custom and things like that. So, I mean, on the one hand, I want to say that you know, this is an unusual context, and the Efrat is unusual, and I don't think my data on Tinder is very representative of what you see in the settlements. However, the interesting thing is, and without wanting to tell too many tales on settlers, there is this, you know, that Tinder does allow for this kind of, you know, hidden hybrid space that allows for intimacies not possible to happen in a very religious and very conservative, and also, you know, heavily militarized, unsafe space to happen. And so it was quite interesting to get a kind of peek into this, you know, behind the curtain of the ways that people have intimate relations outside of the rules of religious and social norms. So, I mean, inconclusive, I guess, is my answer.
Fantastic. Any other questions for Branwen? Any other questions in the, you go ahead and put them in the chat if there's anything else. I don't know if any of the co-conveners or OxDEG people have anything further. Okay, well, in that case,
actually, can I ask a question?
Yes,
just in general. I'm always interested to find other work using Tinder, and because I wrote this last year during the pandemic, I haven't had too much time since then to look into it. But does anyone know of anyone else doing anything similar?
No, I don't.
No, the only thing I can say is we're teaching a course now, as it happens, called Digital Methods, and the session we have this week is on digital tools, which we kind of define as technologies for supplementing conventional anthropological ethnographic research and solving problems which may emerge in the course of anthropological ethnographic research. And I guess your research, and also we recently had Joshua Bluteau speak here as well. And those are both really interesting cases of actually using social media itself as a kind of tool to solve a concrete research issue. So in Joshua's case, he simply didn't have access to consumers in what he was doing, and he found Instagram was a way into that. And this equally solving a very concrete methodological research challenge that you were experiencing in the field. Of course, the social media is connecting people in all sorts of new ways, and it only makes sense that perhaps there are ways of connecting with people on social media that aren't so easy to do in analog fashion. So I find that's a really interesting potential contribution. But as far as Tinder itself goes, I think you're the first person I've heard.
All right, thank you.
Good.
Oh, and I note there's somebody in the chat who is working on using dating apps in the Gulf area.
Oh, great. Oh, that would be so interesting to read.
Yeah.
So I'll leave the
Can you
two of
message me?
you
I'd love to talk about that.
And actually, in your talk, you said something about how ethical guidelines you didn't find them super helpful. I mean, I was recently on a committee looking again at the ASA guidelines, and I sort of was our feeling on the committee was that it was important to keep them as, what do I want to say, less constraining as possible.
Okay.
And so we very consciously made fewer changes in response to the digital than I suppose I was expecting to do before we started. It was mainly about data management and GDPR and all those sorts of things, rather than how different working in a digital environment is or isn't. And I suppose I would say less so than it might seem at first. But I don't actually know if the revision is yet online. Come to think of it, it might be worth double checking. Yeah. Okay. So maybe at this point we should all turn our microphones on and give Branwen a live round of applause to say thank you, and then we will take you to the virtual pub.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for a great talk.
Yeah, and I can't remember what's happening in 2 weeks' time, but there will be something. And see you all then.
And if anybody, again, just to reiterate what David said earlier, if there's anybody that has anything they think they might like to offer in this term, next term, in the near future, by all means get in touch. This always remains a place to kind of present research that's experimental and in progress.
And thanks to Rebecca for sitting in the background and keeping it all running smoothly. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.